Hello, welcome to Reflections on Trust in the Software Supply Chain. My name's Jeremy Long. I'm CTXT on Twitter and Blue Sky. Over 20 years in information security. I'm the founder of the OWASP Dependency Check project. I'm currently a principal security engineer at ServiceNow. The contents of this talk are from my own personal research and do not represent any of the work that I'm doing as part of my day job. The opinions are my own and do not represent those of ServiceNow. Today, we're of course going to talk about software supply chain security. What we're doing today, a gap I see in our current efforts. I will then demo the type of supply chain attack that has kept me up at night since reading about SolarWinds. You're going to want to stick around for the demo. And I'll end with proposing a solution to the trusting trust problem. As we all know, the software supply chain is absolutely massive. The Census 2 study from the Linux Foundation found that all modern software is made up to 70 to 90% open source code. And as you wouldn't be surprised, CI/CD infrastructure is also modern software, and a lot of it is open source code. It's how we build and deploy the modern applications that we build or that we create. Maven, Gradle, NPM, Drone, Spinnaker, Jenkins, the list goes on and on. As I'm kind of focused on the development tool chain, we also have third-party services that are used within our CI/CD environment. They're all modern software, part of the supply chain. And they, too, are modern software made of open source, likely built and deployed using open source technology. When you think about it, the software supply chain is almost incomprehensibly large. And with anything this large, it presents an attack surface that people are going to target. Supply chain attacks are nothing new. From traditional supply chain attacks targeting known vulnerable dependencies to more modern supply chain attacks, some of which may require nation-state level support to accomplish, Gartner predicts that by 2025, 45% of organizations worldwide will experience an attack on their supply chain. These attacks are not going to stop. They're going to evolve, get harder to detect. From an attacker's perspective, it just makes sense. If I can find or introduce a vulnerability in a component used by many organizations, the payoff can be huge. Additionally, supply chain attacks bypass a lot of the traditional controls enterprises have put in place over the years. Another disturbing trend to me has been we've seen more and more attacks against our development tool chain. This scares me, because I've read Ken Thompson's paper, Reflections on Trusting Trust. If you've never read Ken Thompson's paper, I highly recommend it. It's an absolute delightful read. It's a short 3-page paper where Thompson discussed backdooring the compiler in such a way that the backdoor is never in the published source code. Yet, when that subverted compiler compiles the source code for the compiler, to create a new version of the compiler, it injects the backdoor into the compiler, carrying that backdoor forward into version over version of new compilers. Worse, when that subverted compiler is used to compile the operating system, it injects a backdoor into the operating system. From a supply chain perspective, that's absolutely terrifying. How can we trust our builds to produce secure code, secure output? The moral is obvious. You can't trust code that you did not completely create yourself. The SolarWinds breach was very, very close to a trusting trust problem. There was an assumption that the build servers were secure, and yet malware on the build servers injected code, a backdoor, into the Orion product at build time, and then this was distributed to SolarWinds clients through an automated update process. This was distributed to Microsoft, the US government, several security firms. The list goes on and on of who was affected, about 18,000 clients long of who was affected by this breach. SolarWinds and other events brought about the need for the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. This executive order has a ton of great requirements that outline ways that we can improve our cybersecurity. Section 4 specifically on improving the software supply chain security has just fantastic requirements that were outlined. Work on many of these was well underway prior to the executive order being published, but since its publication, we've seen frenzied activity, people producing guidelines, refining the requirements, providing implementation guidelines. But today, I'm going to focus on these three: provenance, software bill of materials, and automated security testing for known and potential vulnerabilities. In a lot of cases, that's software composition analysis. I mean, the entire set of requirements is fantastic, but these three all relate to dependencies. And note that throughout this talk, I may use the term component, artifact, or dependency almost interchangeably because in context, they're almost talking about the same thing. So what is a dependency? Well, by definition, a software component used directly or indirectly by a program. Many of us are familiar with runtime dependencies. This is a runtime dependency graph of an application I'm involved in. From a security perspective, lots of us are familiar with this because of our SCA tooling, software composition analysis. It's reporting on known vulnerabilities in our runtime dependencies, and then requiring patches because members of this community continue to find vulnerabilities in the dependencies that we use. If you talk to some developers, they're almost getting overloaded by these patching requests. But, if we actually look at what this application is and then think about how it was built, in a lot of the build management tools, we might have test scope dependencies. This application, when we include the test scope dependencies, that expands the graph quite a bit. This is also built using a build management system that has plugins that do anything from code generation to helping with the compilation, the packaging, the publication. There's a lot of build plugins in this application as well. That expands this dependency graph to just an enormous size. And you might be thinking, why would I care about all of these dependencies? They're not actually part of the application that is deployed. Well, in a little bit, I'm going to demonstrate that anything running during the build has the ability to affect the build output. Anything running during the build has the ability to affect the build output. When we talk about supply chain security, specifically thinking about artifacts and dependencies, two of the frameworks that you're going to run into are the supply chain level for software artifacts, or SLSA, and the OWASP software component verification standard. Both are great frameworks. They have a ton of requirements that will help you really raise the assurance level of your builds and of your software supply chain. But both of these discuss provenance. That's one of those items that I mentioned earlier. So what is provenance? This is the definition from both SLSA and the software component verification standard. I actually like the definition from the software component verification standard a little bit better. If you go out and read their glossary, they go into pedigree and provenance, and the definitions actually match a little bit better to what we would see in traditional supply chain, shipping, trucking, manufacturing. So I do kind of like their definitions a little bit better, but at its core, the idea of provenance is that we're recording the inputs and outputs of the build. How was this thing made? What was there? So at a high level, if we're going to create provenance, we take a look at what was the source code that was brought in. We record the exact version. We create a record of this, and we digitally sign it. We look at the dependencies that were being brought in. We record the exact version, the names of them, the hash codes. We create a record of this, and we digitally sign it. We look at the build. We look at the build steps, the build tools. We create a record of this. We digitally sign that. And then we look at the build artifacts. We create a record of these. We digitally sign that. And the one thing that I want to emphasize here is this has nothing to do with how secure the build is. This is only a record of what the input and output of the build was. The signatures do not imply that the build artifact is secure. I will say knowing the exact version of the source code and the dependencies that went into the build, fantastic. Knowing the exact version and digitally signed of that build artifact, when you use that as a dependency within your application, you can validate that and be assured that you are using the official version of that dependency, and that's going to raise your assurance level. Sorry, I lost my place. But one thing to note is that other thing about this provenance information is that it will provide a ton of great information in the event of a breach as part of your forensics investigation. Provenance information will have a ton of fantastic information. But at its core, provenance is a record of the inputs and outputs of the build. As SLSA is one of the frameworks that prescribes provenance, we need to take a look at the threats that were covered, or more specifically, what were the threats that were not covered in SLSA version 1.0. Use a compromised runtime dependency. You know, I actually understand why this is probably out of scope of SLSA 1.0. I was not part of the team making any of these decisions, but I think I understand why this one was probably scoped out. What else was scoped out, not considered part of the threats for SLSA 1.0? Use a compromised build time dependency. Again, I kind of get why this was out of scope. I mean, this is actually a hard problem. This is almost the trusting trust problem. And a lot of decisions were made early on. You can read about some of them on salsa.dev. Some of the decisions were made to make the problem a little bit more tractable, so we could start moving forward with improving our supply chain. SLSA provides a ton of great requirements. I think I have a lot of high hopes for what's going on there, and I highly recommend following their work, getting involved. I think eventually we will see better documentation for what's being done for these two threats. But today, what's being done for these two threats? Software composition analysis. That's a primary control that's being used to combat known vulnerable runtime dependencies. I've been involved in software composition analysis since before it was called software composition analysis. These tools let you know if you're using a vulnerable runtime dependency. But what about build plugins? The things running during your build. What do we have today to cover that? Well, we've got SCA tools that work at the entire repository level. These are tools that are going to scan anything in your repository, be it a test dependency, a build plugin, a transit dependency of your build plugins, and it's likely not going to have a lot of context about what's in there. But it'll flag it as known vulnerable. Well, this is useful, but when you lose some of that context, it becomes a little harder to deal with. Luckily, most of the people using these tools are actually, it's part of a layered defense that they have. So what else do we have? Well, with 8.0 release of the OWASP dependency check project, you can actually scan your Maven and Gradle plugins. You have to use the Maven or Gradle plugin. You can't use the CLI or the Docker image, but you can scan your build plugins using the dependency check project to look for known vulnerabilities in your plugins. Right now, I'm not aware of any other SCA vendors that are doing this. I'm not saying that they're not out there. I just don't know of any. Another thing that we have to cover these known vulnerabilities is the software bill of materials, or SBOM. The two most common formats are, of course, CycloneDX and SPDX. CycloneDX is a flagship OWASP project, and SPDX is from the Linux Foundation. SBOMs commonly cover your runtime dependencies. They can cover so much more than just your runtime dependencies. You know, if you go look at the CycloneDX specification, they outline a ton of different types of bills of material that can be captured within the CycloneDX format. In a lot of cases, your companies will ask their vendors for an SBOM so that they can understand if there's any risks with using that software from a vulnerability, licensing compliance, legal compliance reasons. So it's great. We've got a way of tracking our runtime dependencies. But again, what about that common theme that I have here? What about your build dependencies? How was this product made that you're using? Well, luckily, Steve Springett, the founder of the CycloneDX, is a very smart individual. He actually, I asked him a year ago if any work was being done to document build time dependencies. He pointed me at an issue in the CycloneDX repository out on GitHub. That issue was open May 17th, 2020, more than a couple years ago. And happy to announce that the team, with the release of CycloneDX 1.5 earlier this year, introduced the manufacturing bill of materials. It's fantastic. We have a way of capturing how these products were built. We have a way of recording this. It may take a little time for some of the tooling to catch up, specifically the tooling that is going to generate the manufacturing bill of materials, but we're on our way. However, SCA and SBOM, they're only good at capturing known vulnerable dependencies. Worrying about and monitoring for known vulnerable dependencies is important, but what supply chain attack has kept me up at night since reading about SolarWinds? I guarantee it's not worrying about known vulnerable dependencies. Mark Curphey over at Crash Override has had some really great tweets about software supply chain security, such as tweeting about remote code execution in a logging framework prior to Log4Shell. But this tweet in particular has always stood out with me a little bit. What if a library in an IDE backdoored everything built with it? To me, this is a little short-sighted. IDE plugins aren't used in CI/CD environments. What if a build plugin was backdoored and compromised everything built with it in our CI/CD environments? That's how we build and ship code. Right now, if a malicious build plugin were identified, say something like Swagger Code Gen, or even a testing framework like JUnit were compromised. They weren't, but as a thought exercise, think about it. If they were, and they could execute a SolarWinds style attack, how would you figure out what was compromised? How would you figure out where these were deployed in your environment? If you think hunting for Log4j was bad, something like this, I don't even want to think about. So let's talk about how we build one in Java. This is the malicious dependencies repo that I open sourced this morning. This is going to demonstrate how a malicious build time dependency can compromise your build. So I just have to switch over here. Give me 1 second. So this is the repo out on GitHub. Hope I didn't really expand that. Sorry. So the analyzer here, this is something that the threat actor or malicious agent would own. It is a multi-module Maven project, and then this demo application here is something that would your engineers at your organization would have built. So let's jump over to a couple of terminals here. This white terminal is the attacker's terminal. I'm just going to spin up netcat and let that listen on port 9999. And then we're going to jump over here, and I'm just going to run the build on the demo project. It builds, we see the Spring Boot banner, and everything succeeds. And then we're just going to run the application here. We're going to spin this up. We see Spring Boot started and Tomcat initialized, and it's running on port 8080. So let's see what this application does. Curl localhost 8080. Greetings from Spring Boot. This is just a vanilla Spring Boot application created by the Spring Boot initializer. But what happened on the attacker's terminal? Did anything connect back? Sure enough, I have a reverse shell right here on the developer's workstation. This could have been a reverse shell on, on an EC2 instance out in AWS when you deployed this application to production. So how could this have happened? How could this backdoor have gotten into my code base? I'm going to kill the Spring Boot application here, and we're going to jump back over to the terminal, the attacker's terminal, and we see that this connection was ended because when Spring Boot closed, the socket ended. To kind of prove that these two were actually connected. So let's do a little investigation here. Let's see what were the classes that were compiled and deployed as part of this application. We've got this hello controller in the Spring Boot application. This is actually what created the greetings from Spring Boot. The demo application class here, this is actually just how Spring Boot starts up. It's just how the Spring Boot applications work. CTXT listener. I have no idea what this is. Spoiler alert, that's where the backdoor is. But as a developer, I never created that code. If we jump over to the developer, the demo application here that the developer created, all we have is the demo application and hello controller, and there's really no code in here. I mean, normally there would be, it would be a more full-fledged application, but as the example, there's nothing in here. If we look at the build, the only thing that I did was I heard about this really useful Spring Build Analyzer. It actually looks at my Spring Boot application during compile time to identify if there's any misconfigurations. A couple of my buddies have used it. They said there was, they found some bugs in their Spring Boot application that really, it helped them in their testing and whatnot. But as we saw, a CTXT listener was injected. So we have to probably go look at this Spring Build Analyzer project. And if we go over here, this is the Spring Build Analyzer project. And in Spring Build Analyzer, we've got that annotation processor that doesn't really do anything. It just cycles through all the annotations. I'm not going to walk through a lot of the code here, just high level. But there's no CTXT listener. Where did that come from? Well, this is a multi-module Maven project. So we have a Maven, or a build helper up here. And if we look at build helper, this is a Maven extension. It's just how you build, extend Maven a little bit. But again, there is no code here. Where did the backdoor come from? Well, I made this a little bit more complicated to show a few different ways that you can inject malicious code into projects. Even if you ran static analysis against this project, you may skip the test directories. You may not even look at the test directories, and yet the test directories right here contain compile, ensure Spring annotation, and sensor drop. And sensor drop is, sure enough, right where that CTXT listener exists. And to note, it exists as a static string. It's not actually a code construct, so even if you did static analysis looking for things like process builder, it's not going to find it because this is a string, not a language construct. So I'm going to jump back to the slides here because it's going to be a little easier to walk through how this compromise happens. So let me just stop mirroring. And we'll jump back to the slides. Cool. So this is kind of an explanation of the slides, of the demo that we just saw. The build helper compiles, Maven runs the compile. It compiles all of those test classes, and then the test case actually copies those malicious files from the test classes of the build helper into the target classes of the Spring Build Analyzer. Then Maven starts running, and the Spring Build Analyzer source code gets compiled and placed into the target classes right alongside all of those malicious classes that were injected by the build helper. This is then all of these are then packaged up as a jar, and then we can publish those to something like Maven Central. Then your developers build their application. They use some dependency that they thought was safe, and it subverts the build and causes, and we end up with a backdoor in the build artifact. The first version of this attack that I built was actually in the OWASP dependency check project. It is an unreleased version that I will never release. It was just kind of a proof of concept. I do want to point out, while this attack is very, very easy to do in the Java ecosystem, attack is not limited to Java. A threat actor with enough influence, be it monetary, geopolitical, ideological, they have the ability to inject attacks like this into your software supply chain. It may be the long game. It may take, being a positive contributing member of the open source community to build up enough trust until you can inject an attack like this, but it is possible. It is absolutely possible to have an insider threat in your open source community. This could happen through your build plugins, Maven, Gradle, Poetry. I said it's not just Java. Your testing frameworks. It can even be your Maven or Gradle wrapper. I do focus a little bit on Java because I'm most familiar with the Java ecosystem. So what can we do to try and raise our assurance of our builds? Well, SLSA actually documented one mitigation, and this is actually in those threats that were out of scope for the runtime, runtime dependency. I actually think this applies to the build dependencies as well, and their mitigation is to apply SLSA recursively. Most organizations are just at the very beginning if they're even thinking about trying to apply SLSA with any rigor. There are a few shining examples out there where they're at SLSA level 3. I'm sure there's vendors in the business hall that would help you achieve this, but most organizations are just at the very beginning of being able to do this. So just think about the level of effort to apply SLSA recursively. This is just the Maven build. What about Maven itself, the JDK, the operating system? That is a lot of effort to apply SLSA recursively to everything. In many cases, the developers working on these open source components that you're using are doing this in their free time. They're volunteers. And if we're asking them now to start applying SLSA to not only build secure applications, but secure their builds, provide provenance, publish to SigStore, that's a lot of effort. And if we want to see this done, the organizations that are using this open source code may need to start contributing back to these open source developers, be it by having your developers contribute back. If that's not possible, consider sponsoring the developers that build the open source that you use. But it all comes down to what level of assurance do you need? How much of this do you need to cover? Some people may not require a high level of assurance, and others will need this entire set of dependencies covered completely. Is there anything else that can save us? Well, a common thing is the idea of reproducible builds. This is the idea that if I build my software on system A and I build my software on system B, I will get the exact same bit-for-bit output, and I can calculate a checksum. Anybody else in the community that has access to the source code can build this application and get the exact same bit-for-bit output, and we will have a checksum. And this will prove that there's no malware on system A that could have compromised that build output. But what if the malicious code was a build plugin? It's brought into system A and compromises the build output. It's brought into system B when we do the build, and it compromises the build output, resulting in a reproducibly compromised build with the exact same checksum. That demo application that I showed earlier, that uses reproducible builds, and it is reproducibly compromised. It's important to understand the difference between vulnerable and malicious. And to me, this is really the difference between traditional supply chain attacks and modern supply chain attacks. Traditionally, we would see people exploiting vulnerabilities in components, known vulnerable dependencies. This is what SCA and SBOM are really good at finding, known vulnerable. Modern supply chain attacks, though, these are intentionally subverting the supply chain. So what can we do to detect malicious? Well, after reading about SolarWinds, I was challenged to come up with a methodology to identify if a build had been tampered with, or at build time, was something injected at build time. And I came up with the idea of binary source validation, or validating that the build artifact could have been produced by the given source code. Sounds hard, right? This only gets really difficult when we get down to the level of native executables. And even then, I think there's some things that we can do. But remember, SolarWinds, that was .NET. That was C# code. So I think there's a lot that we can do in that ecosystem to detect things like this. And the idea here is to simply build a model from the build artifact, build a model from the source code, and compare the two models to look for differences. It's really easy to create this model from source code because we have lectures and parsers in just about every language that we use, well, in every language we use. How detailed that model is going to be a little dependent on the level of assurance needed, but in my POCs and testing of this, it was sufficient to just extract a high-level model of the classes, the constants, the methods that were defined, the methods that were then called, so the call chain, but not any more detailed than that. And it was sufficient to identify the introduction of malicious code. If you've never looked at like Java or .NET, they compile down to an intermediary language, bytecode for Java, and the common intermediary language for .NET. And this is just a Java class file opened up in a hex editor. And you can see there is so much information that is just clear text visible in this class file, just in a hex editor. So, of course, you can parse these, class files to generate the exact same model. And then once you have these two models created, you can simply compare them. If they look the same and there's no, meaningful differences between the two, well, you can be pretty assured that nothing happened within the build. It's not saying that there isn't malicious code in the original source code, but by doing this comparison, you can be assured that nothing malicious happened during the build. You can do the same thing in other technologies like interpreted languages like Python or JavaScript. In some cases, your model generation tool may be the same for both your source code and your distribution artifact. The build artifact in those cases is a lot of cases the exact same as the source code, but I don't think a lot of people are even validating that what's in GitHub tagged as version 1.0 is the same as what's in NPM or PyPy tagged as the same version. Nobody's actually, to my knowledge, nobody's actually doing that comparison to make sure that those two things actually match and are the same thing. If the two models are different, though, if something malicious was injected, it really stands out. It's obvious to see that something bad happened during the build. So some of the challenges are, of course, compiler optimizations and just known changes. For instance, in Java, if you do string concatenation, string plus string, in the class file, it ends up being string builder append.append. And there's other things like this that you just have to account for a little bit. Another challenge are, of course, code generators. I'm not talking about like Gen AI code generators. I'm talking about the more formulaic code generators that are common to see in Java builds and other technology stacks, where you take like a schema and you create a bunch of POJOs or classes with fields, getters, and setters for binding. Those are the types of generators that can cause a problem because that source code is in that code is in the binary, but it's not in the source code. Because these things are formulaic and because there's known compiler changes, we can build this all into heuristics of this comparison algorithm. And lastly, the challenge of native executables. It's more difficult to extract this information from native executables, but even then, I think just extracting the constants and the system calls may be sufficient to identify the introduction of truly malicious code on the level of like a SolarWinds. There might be some more subtle things that you may have to really dig in more to identify, but the larger, truly malicious code, I think, could be found just by looking at syscalls and constants. But that is an area of research. So that's something that I'm proposing. It's not something that I'm open sourcing because, well, I already maintain one open source project. I don't really want to sign up for maintaining another one. So what are some of the things that you can do today? Because this doesn't exist yet. Reduce the number of dependencies. Follow the Deming principle. Use fewer, higher quality vendors. If you talk to anybody in the SAA or supply chain space, By reducing the number of dependencies you have, both runtime and build time, you're reducing your attack surface. Another thing you can do is don't use code generators during the build. Use them. They're useful. Absolutely use them. But use them during the development process. Do not use them in the build process. Check that code into your code repo. Treat it like any other code that you would normally author. Consider using OWASP dependency check to scan your Maven and Gradle build plugins. Right now, I don't know of any malicious Maven or Gradle build plugins, but if one was identified, it will likely get a CVE, and dependency check could at least flag that, which of your builds were affected. Lastly, talk to your SAST and supply chain security vendors about the idea of build verification or binary source validation. I think that there is a lot of promise in this technology. So in summary, I hope I've proven to you that the trusting trust problem is very real. Any code running during the build has the ability to affect the build output reproducibly. Lastly, support your open source developers. They're the ones that are going to secure the builds of the open source dependencies that you use. Are there any questions? I've got a few minutes. I can take some now, or we can move to the wrap room. I think there are mics there.
So when you say reducing dependencies, what would you say for a language like Rust, where literally everything requires an import of a dependency to run the library?
I am actually not very familiar with the Rust language or build ecosystem, unfortunately. The most common places that are going to be vulnerable to something like this are the ones where you have a multiple stages of your build, where you might have, like in Maven, you start off compilation, test, package, verify. At the end of verify is where most people run GPG sign. That's where they sign. And anything running before that signature has the ability, like I just showed like copying classes in. You can actually use utilities to modify classes that were already generated. Or you could use techniques like Lombok does that kind of, you just have to go look at Lombok if you're not familiar with it from that kind of a perspective within Java. But yeah, sorry, I'm not as familiar with Rust, so I can't really answer that question.
Check, check. As a consumer of software, how do we start the conversation about this with vendors and sort of push them along with this?
I think that is unfortunately, that's the main thing, is you just have to ask them about it. Point them to my talk here. We've seen SolarWinds. We haven't seen other examples. That's not saying that they're not out there or have happened, because it is also possible to do this style of attack, but have several conditions in that backdoor that would have to be satisfied for that backdoor to actually fire. It may have to be running on an EC2 instance in this zone, to actually have that. There's ways to trigger things to really limit that. So I'm not saying that these attacks haven't happened. We just haven't seen anything reporting of them yet. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.